December 21st, 1944. It was 6:12 in the morning when the world at Malmedy, Belgium, seemed to hold its breath. The air cut like broken glass, each breath a white plume that vanished in the dim blue light before dawn. Snow settled on shattered brick and twisted iron. Broken factory windows stared like blind eyes across a landscape made strange by artillery and fire. Silence, which in war is only the momentary hush before sound remembers itself, pressed down hard inside the skeleton of an abandoned coal processing plant. A single figure crouched in the frost. He was 19 years old. His name was Francis Sherman Curry. In his hands he held a borrowed, unproven bazooka. Slung over his back, a .30 caliber machine gun banged against his pack with every slight movement. Around him there were no sandbags, no prepared trenches, no platoon to fall back to, only the ruined guts of a building and a narrow road that led to a small bridge. It was a choke point, 150 feet of frozen stone that, if taken by German armor, would give the enemy a lane to cut supply and retreat routes for the Americans dug in beyond. The Ardennes forest thought he was not a movie hero. He smelled of cold sweat and old gun oil. His fingers were numb from the cold. He had the hungry look of someone who had not slept in a day and had already seen too much. He was frightened. He was tired. He was, in every way that matters, alone. The Ardennes had become the stage for Hitler's last major gamble on the Western Front. Under a gray canopy of snow and fog, German divisions, including hardened SS tank crews and veteran Panzer units, surged through the woods with orders to split Allied lines and seize the crucial port of Antwerp. American units were thin, exhausted, and at points widely dispersed. Communication lines were snapped. Anti-tank teams had been knocked out. In the chaos of the first assaults, gaps had been opened in the defensive web. Company K of the 120th Infantry Regiment, part of the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, found itself responsible for holding roads that could not be allowed to fall. Curry huddled beside a blown-out doorway 30 yards from that bridge. He could see the thin ribbon of road bending through the snow, and beyond it, the tree line where German movement would appear. He could hear a sound that makes men stop inside the bones, the metallic grind of treads on iced earth, a dull growl that travels through the solace and into the teeth. He had been told to hold. That was all. The other anti-tank teams were gone. The wires carrying orders were severed. Help, if it was coming from a place that felt farther than any map. When the column emerged, it did so with the slow, deliberate menace of machines built to swallow steel and will. The lead vehicle was a Panzer Mark V, its turret crawling like the head of some animal that could think faster than the men beneath the metal. Curry had seconds. He set the bazooka at an angle that any prudent officer would have called suicidal, too close for the weapon's designed safety, too exposed to imagine an escape after firing. He could have slipped back into ruined brick and tried for survival. Instead, he chose a line of sight that would expose the tank's weaker flank as it rounded the bottleneck of the bridge. The first rocket screamed, and for a moment the world narrowed to smoke and thunder. The Panzer's flank erupted. The turret shuddered and stopped. Men shouted in a language he did not need to understand. Steel began to burn. Curry did not pause to let the sound of that hit settle against his bones. He dropped the launcher and ran, firing a Browning automatic rifle from broken windows. picking at infantry as they scrambled for cover. He ran outside and grabbed where he could. The .50 caliber mounted on a ruined half-track, a desperate, brilliant gamble to keep the road clear that morning for the next 3 hours. The factory and the road in front of it became a theater of improvisation. Curry moved like a shadow between smashed walls and burned vehicles. He fired, scrounged ammunition, pried wounded men from beneath fallen masonry, and dragged them to shelter. He jammed rockets into launchers that had seen better days. He climbed onto a patched half-track and roared the .50 caliber into life, the barrel pulsing with fire in the snow. When the machine finally jammed from heat, he ran again, trading positions, changing weapons, becoming the only anti-tank force the Germans could find. There is a peculiar intimacy to a fight at such short range, the clatter of magazine belts, the ring of ice as a bullet catches metal, the animal yelp of engine and man. Once, in the eerie gray between volleys, Curry and a German soldier were no more than 15 feet apart. They stared, both exhausted, both hollowed by cold, and without ceremony, each turned and went the other way. For a second, the war looked like what it is at its clearest. Other men, as broken as you are, trying to survive. He did not set out to be an emblem. He set out to keep a road from being taken and 5 men from being crushed under steel. He made decisions on instinct and necessity, reloads where there were none, shifts of position where there was no safety, rescue where there was no room to breathe. The snow kept falling. Mortar began to break the air in screaming violins. Tracks crept again. Officers would later calculate the strategic importance of those few hundred feet of frozen Belgian road. For Curry, in those hours, the calculus was smaller and harder. Wounded men behind him. Tanks ahead. Do you run? Or do you stay? Before we move deeper into the hours that followed, pause with that choice. Before this story ends, ask yourself, when the order comes from nothing, when there are no commanders and no applause, do you stand? Would you find the courage to make a suicidal angle, not because you wanted glory, but because turning your back meant certain death for others? Keep that question with you as we follow the morning that turned a single act into a turning point in the Bulge. Before he was a soldier standing alone in the snow, Francis Sherman Curry was a boy from the quiet hills of upstate New York. He was born on June 29, 1925, in a small town called Loch Sheldrake, the kind of place where the rhythm of life followed the seasons, and where childhood was measured not by wealth or privilege but by chores, school, and the steady hum of family routines. His father died when Francis was only 12. It was a loss that left a hollow place in the home and a responsibility that arrived too soon. His mother and grandmother raised him, teaching him to work with his hands, to fix what was broken, and to keep his word that he was not the sort of boy who filled notebooks with ambition. He built forts in the woods, tinkered with engines, and spent long hours alone, learning the kind of quiet resilience that life in small towns demands. Teachers remembered him as polite but unremarkable, a young man with a steady gaze and few words. There was no hint that history would ever know his name. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Francis was 16. He watched older boys leave town one by one, returning in uniforms that carried both pride and shadow. He wanted to go with them. At 17, he tried to enlist but was turned away, too young. So he waited. On his 18th birthday, he went back to the recruiter's office and joined the United States Army. In the spring of 1943, Curry began his training. The Army didn't make heroes. It made survivors. At Fort Jackson, South Carolina, he learned to march until his feet bled, to crawl under barbed wire while live rounds snapped overhead, to fire and clean the M1 rifle until muscle memory replaced hesitation. There was no time to dream. Every day hammered a boy was hammered into something harder. He learned to sleep through noise, to think under fire, to eat cold rations in the rain. Those lessons, unglamorous, repetitive, and brutal, were the foundations that would later keep him alive when everything around him fell apart. He was assigned to the 30th Infantry Division, a unit that called itself Old Hickory in honor of Andrew Jackson. They were citizen soldiers, farmhands, mechanics, factory workers, ordinary Americans turned warriors. The 30th landed in Normandy in June 1944, weeks after D-Day, and began its long, grinding march through northern France. They fought at Mortain, where German tanks tried to split the Allied lines, and in the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden. It was there that Curry saw his first real combat, chaotic, deafening, and terrifying. Like so many young soldiers, he learned quickly that courage isn't loud. It's the quiet that comes after panic, when you realize you have no choice but to move. He lost friends. He saw death at arm's length, sudden, final, and ordinary. The glamour of war vanished within days. What remained was the task: hold the line, protect the man beside you, keep moving forward. By December of 1944, Curry had been hardened by 6 months on the front. He'd seen cities burn, tanks smolder, and villages emptied. He had learned to tell the difference between artillery by sound alone, and to read the rhythm of machine gun fire like a language. But even that experience could not prepare him for what was coming in the ARDENNES. When the Germans launched their massive counteroffensive through the snowbound forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. Allied troops were caught off guard. The so-called Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the U.S. Army in World War II. The weather grounded Allied aircraft. Fog cloaked German movements. American lines broke under the shock of surprise. Curry's regiment, the 120th Infantry, was sent toward Malmedy, a name that would soon become carved into the memory of the war. Their mission was simple on paper: hold the vital roadways leading west. In reality, it was a near-suicidal assignment. Panzer divisions, including the feared SS units, were pushing with everything they had left. Tanks outnumbered rifles. Communication was collapsing. Curry didn't yet know that within days he would be one of the last men standing between a Caleste, German spearhead and the vulnerable wounded behind him. He didn't know that his name would one day appear in Medal of Honor records, or that statues would be cast in his image. On the eve of December 21st, he was just a 19-year-old corporal trying to follow orders, clean his weapon, and get a few hours of sleep in the cold. It's easy, from the distance of history, to imagine heroes as men born for destiny. Francis Curry's story strips that illusion bare. He wasn't fearless. He wasn't larger than life. He was simply ready when the moment came, ready because discipline had replaced doubt, and because, somewhere in the quiet of his upbringing, he had learned the meaning of duty. And as the snow began to fall over the Ardennes, That quiet boy from New York was about to face an enemy he could see, hear, and feel through the frozen ground, an enemy made of steel and command. His courage would not come from glory, but from instinct, forged by every small lesson he had carried from home. Stories like his remind us that history's greatest acts often come from those who never sought them. If you believe stories like this matter, stories of courage born from ordinary lives, make sure others hear them too. Because what happens next is not legend. It is a fact, witnessed and recorded, the morning when a single soldier refused to run. At 6:28 that morning, the silence of Malmedy was shattered. It began faintly, the grinding churn of metal on frozen mud, treads biting through ice, muffled voices in German carried by the wind. Then came the low vibration underfoot, the rhythmic, rolling tremor that only tanks make when they move in formation. For a few long seconds, the sound alone seemed to fill the ruins. Francis Curry pressed himself against a broken doorway, his breath fogging the frosted steel of his borrowed bazooka. Ahead lay the narrow road and the bridge, no wider than a country lane, hemmed by snowdrifts and rubble. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a panzer column was coming straight toward him. Inside the ruined factory, 5 wounded Americans lay pinned beneath fallen brick and timber, men trapped when artillery had ripped through the roof the night before. They could not move. They could barely speak. Curry knew what would happen if the tanks broke through. They'd crush the building and the wounded along with it. Behind them, the road opened toward the rest of the division, hundreds of soldiers, vehicles, and supply routes that would collapse if this bridge fell. The first tank appeared through the fog like a moving wall of black iron, a Panzer Mark V Panther, broad, low, and heavy, its long cannon sweeping side to side in slow, deliberate arcs. Its armor could shrug off rifle rounds like raindrops. Infantry followed behind, their silhouettes cutting through the mist, rifles ready. The German advance was confident. They expected resistance ahead, not here. Curry had no orders. The radio lines were dead. He had one bazooka and a single rocket. The shot would be dangerously close, too short a range for the weapon to arm fully, too exposed for him to reload safely. But there was no other choice. He dragged the launcher across the icy floor, propping himself behind a collapsed beam that faced the road at a sharp angle. His fingers, stiff and numb, fumbled with the rocket tube. He remembered the training manuals. Aim for the side armor, thinner than the front, easier to breach. But the Panther was turning toward the bridge. Presenting its flank for only a few seconds, Curry inhaled once, steady and deep, and held his breath. The world exploded. The bazooka kicked hard into his shoulder, the rocket trailing a streak of smoke before slamming into the Panther's side. Fire burst from the hull in a rush of orange light. The tank stopped dead, its turret frozen mid-turn. German voices shouted, confusion, panic. Flames licked upward through the snow. Curry didn't wait to see if the crew survived. He dropped the launcher and sprinted back toward the building as bullets began to whip through the air. He snatched a Browning automatic rifle from a fallen comrade, braced it on a shattered window frame, and opened fire. The weapon bucked hard as he swept the road, cutting down German infantry as they scrambled for cover behind the wrecked tank. Smoke rolled across the snow like a curtain when the Browning's barrel glowed red. Curry switched weapons again, this time to a .30. caliber machine gun mounted on a half-ruined jeep outside the factory. He crouched low, reloaded, and pulled the trigger. The gun roared to life, its tracer rounds cutting red lines through the fog, tearing into the road where German troops advanced. For a moment, the enemy broke, the rhythm of their assault faltered. But another sound rose above the din, deeper, heavier. A second Panzer rolled forward, slower, wiser, its turret already scanning for the source of the fire. Curry's position was marked. His bazooka lay empty. He crawled through a hole in the wall, belly pressed to the frozen ground, and found the body of a soldier with a pack still slung over his shoulder. Inside, one rocket, cold and clean. Curry loaded it, slid behind a low pile of debris, and waited. The second tank crept closer. He could hear the mechanical click of its gears, the heavy breath of its engine. 25 yards, 20, 15. He waited until the turret turned away, exposing its vulnerable flank. Then he fired again. Another direct hit. The explosion ripped through the armor, flames spewing from the tank's hatches. German infantry shouted, stumbling backward in shock. A third tank behind it reversed abruptly, misjudging its turn and blocking the narrow road. For the first time that morning, the enemy stopped moving forward. Curry took the chance. He ran back into the factory, coughing through smoke and dust. Inside, the 5 wounded men were still alive, though barely conscious. He pried up fallen beams with a length of metal piping, one by one, dragging them to a safer corner behind collapsed walls. He gave them water, pressed hands to their shoulders, and told them they'd be all right, though he knew the lie in his own words. Then the shelling began. Mortar rounds screamed overhead, slamming into the roof and yard. Chunks of concrete fell like hail. Curry threw himself over the nearest wounded man as debris rained down. When the shaking stopped, he heard it again, the sound that never left his dreams for the rest of his life. Tank treads. This time flanking to the north. He checked his weapons. The bazooka was empty. The rifles are nearly dry. No grenades left. He looked toward the bridge and saw it, a burned-out American half-track from the previous day's fighting. Its armor crumpled, smoke still curling from its engine. Mounted on top was a Browning .50 caliber machine gun. If it worked, it could hold off infantry and even damage lighter armored vehicles. But it was completely exposed. No walls, no cover. Just open ground between him and it. It was suicide. Curry didn't think twice. He slung his rifle, took one look back at the men he'd saved, and whispered to himself, "Let's finish this." He ran. Bullets tore the air around him. The ground erupted as mortar struck nearby, sending geysers of ice and mud into the sky. He stumbled once, righted himself, and kept moving. Behind him, the factory shuddered under shell fire. Ahead, the half-track loomed like a dead animal in the snow. He climbed onto it, his hands burning on the frozen metal. The moment his head rose above the frame, rifle fire erupted. Bullets cracked past his ears, splintering the vehicle's hull. He pulled back the charging handle and squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber roared, a thunderous, rolling sound that swallowed everything else. The recoil shook the wreck beneath him. Tracer rounds slashed red arcs through the fog, cutting down German infantry as they tried to regroup. A third Panzer halted and began to reverse, its crew abandoning it under the storm of fire. For nearly 20 minutes, Curry held the line. Alone, smoke and snow blurred together until the battlefield looked unreal, a place between worlds. Each burst from the gun sent waves of heat through the freezing air. When it jammed, he kicked the release and reloaded. When the barrel overheated, he switched to short bursts. Around him, the ground was littered with shell casings and the torn cloth of fallen soldiers. Then, finally, silence. The gun jammed for good, the metal too warped to fire. Curry dropped from the half-track, stumbling into a ditch. He was shaking from exhaustion and cold. His helmet was gone. Blood streaked his face. But the road was still his. The bridge still stood. For that moment, Francis Curry had done what no plan, no order, no unit had managed. He had stopped the German advance dead in its tracks. The snow fell quietly again. In the distance, fire still glowed inside the broken carcasses of tanks. The wounded behind him were alive. The line had held and so began the 3 most harrowing hours of his young life, hours that would turn an ordinary soldier into one of the last legends of the chaos. Ardennes, if stories like this remind you of what human courage looks like stripped of rank and ceremony, help keep them alive. Because what happened next would test even the limits of human endurance when a single man, frostbitten and half-broken, continued to fight an army alone. Francis Curry's sprint to the half-track had carried him through a blizzard of bullets and fire, but what followed would stretch the limits of human endurance. For the next 3 hours, the broken ground around that small bridge in Malmedy became a crucible, one man's fight against the weight of Antangin Dinjuan Army. The .50 caliber gun on the half-track thundered like rolling thunder through the fog. Its recoil jolted through his arms, the sound echoing off the ruined factory walls. Each tracer round drew a red line through the morning haze, slicing into the snowbanks where German soldiers had taken cover. He swept the barrel left and right, bursting short, controlled streams to conserve ammunition. The ground around him erupted as return fire peppered the wreck. Sparks flew off the twisted armor. Bullets clanged against steel. He had no cover, no support, nowhere to hide. Every pull of the trigger was an invitation for a bullet in return. But he stayed on the gun, eyes narrowed, muscles locked. The smell of burning oil mixed with gunpowder and snow until the air itself seemed to burn. A third tank lurched forward from the tree line, attempting to flank the position from the left. Its cannon pivoted toward the factory, ready to clear what the first 2 had failed to destroy. Curry aimed for its supporting infantry instead, cutting through them with devastating bursts. The tank halted, reversed, and then veered away. For now, even armor hesitated to cross the open ground. Then, silence again. That awful, deceptive silence that makes soldiers flinch. The gun's barrel steamed. The metal hissed where snow melted on contact. Curry's gloves were torn, his hands blistered from heat and friction. He reached for another belt of ammunition, the last one, and realized it was jammed in the feed tray. He kicked the mount, cursed, and forced the mechanism free. The Browning barked again, louder, angrier, until smoke began curling from the barrel. Finally, the weapon gave out, overheated, useless. Curry dropped from the half-track, hit the frozen earth, and crawled into a nearby ditch. His chest heaved. Blood ran down his leg from a grazing wound. The world had shrunk to his breathing, shallow, ragged clouds of steam. Around him, the air was filled with the distant groan of tank engines repositioning. The Germans were regrouping. He could have stayed hidden. He could have waited for help that might never come. But something in him refused to yield. He had seen the wounded he'd pulled from the rubble, faces pale, bleeding, waiting for him to come back. The line would hold only as long as he kept fighting Dot, so he moved again. Curry crawled through wreckage and snow, shifting from one broken wall to the next, scavenging ammunition wherever he could find it, rifles from fallen comrades, grenades from empty belts, clips pried from frozen hands. He fought like a man half-possessed, appearing and disappearing through holes in the factory, firing short. Sharp bursts that kept the Germans guessing about how many defenders remained. He found an M1 Garand rifle and used it from the upper windows, picking off advancing soldiers one by one. When he ran out of ammunition, he hurled grenades through shattered doorways, driving the enemy back from the bridge. He shot out the tires of a German Kubelwagen, attempting to flank from the right, forcing its crew to flee. At one point, a mortar exploded nearby, hurling him backward against a wall. He felt the sharp sting of shrapnel in his shoulder and the ringing void that follows a blast. When his hearing returned, the only sound was his own heartbeat and the creak of the building settling under the weight of snow and smoke. Then came a moment that would stay with him forever. As he reloaded in the shadows of a doorway, he looked up and saw a German soldier no more than 15 feet away, crouched behind a broken pillar. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide with exhaustion and terror. For an instant, neither raised their weapon. They simply stared, two young men from different worlds, both freezing, both filthy, both wishing they were anywhere else. After a long second, both turned and ran in opposite directions. That second, that pause in violence, said more about war than 100 battles. Could. By 9 a.m. The Germans were desperate to end the resistance. 3 tanks advanced together this time, their formation staggered, infantry spilling from the tree line to cover them. The road trembled under their combined weight. Smoke from burning vehicles drifted low and thick, mixing with falling snow. Curry, now nearly out of ammunition, limped to the second floor of the factory. He carried the same battered bazooka he had used earlier, and miraculously, he found a single rocket in the wreckage of a jeep outside. He loaded it carefully, shoulders shaking from fatigue. He waited. The lead tank slowed at the bend, its side armor turning just enough to give him a chance. He aimed, exhaled, and fired. The rocket struck clean. The tank erupted in flame, its crew spilling out through the hatch. Curry dropped the launcher and reached for his rifle. He sighted down the Garand and fired at one of the fleeing officers, catching him in the leg. The man fell, screaming as the rest scattered, and then, as if some unseen tide had turned, the German offensive began to break. Officers barked orders. Infantry pulled back toward the trees. The third tank reversed awkwardly, tracks grinding as it retreated down the road. In the distance, the thump of American artillery began to echo. Reinforcements had arrived, their shells landing among the retreating enemy. Curry slumped against a wall, too weak to stand. His ears rang, his body trembled, his leg throbbed with pain. But he realized, dimly, that it was over. The bridge still stood. The road was his. The 5 wounded soldiers behind him were alive. For 3 hours, one 19-year-old had held off tanks. Infantry, and artillery, alone. Later, when questioned by officers, Curry would insist he hadn't been brave, only trapped, only doing what he had to do. But history would see it differently. The wreckage left behind told the story. Multiple tanks disabled, German infantry scattered, and a strategic crossing still in American hands died in the snow that morning. He had done more than delay an advance. He had broken its momentum. The time he bought allowed Allied artillery to reposition and crush the German thrust before it could pierce deeper into the lines. His stand, however small on the map, rippled outward across the entire Battle of the Bulge. When the gunfire faded and the last tank disappeared into the fog, Curry staggered back into the factory. He checked on the wounded, covered them with his own torn jacket, and sat beside them. Snow drifted through the holes in the roof. For the first time in hours, there was no sound but breathing. He didn't feel victorious. He felt spent, frozen, bruised, and aching. But the road was silent. The line had held. That silence was the sound of survival, a sound that echoed far beyond that Belgian bridge. If one soldier's endurance could stop an armored column, imagine what remembering his name could do. Take a moment to reflect on what it means to hold the line when everything inside you says to run. Because the story of Francis Curry is not just about battle. It's about the breaking point where duty becomes something more than orders, where one man's will becomes the edge that history turns on. When the echoes of battle finally faded, Francis Sherman Curry did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had been frozen, broken, and somehow left standing. The smell of burning oil hung heavy in the air, mixed with the iron tang of blood and the acrid smoke of shattered engines. The snow that had fallen clean that morning was now stained black and red, steaming in patches where fire met frost. Curry leaned against the wall of the ruined factory, rifle hanging loosely at his side. His leg burned where shrapnel had grazed it. His fingers were numb from the cold and recoil. His throat was raw from shouting over the thunder of his own gunfire. And yet, in the sudden quiet, his senses sharpened again. The creak of twisted metal, the faint crackle of fires, the soft moans of the wounded behind him. He turned toward them. The 5 men he had pulled from the rubble were still alive, barely. One had a shattered femur, another a mangled hand, and the rest were pale from blood loss. But they were breathing. He crouched beside them, checking pulses, giving them water, adjusting their bandages. He didn't speak much. Words didn't belong in a place like this. Outside, the snow continued to fall. It was heavier now, clinging to the black hulls of the destroyed tanks, muffling the world in white silence. The bridge, the target of the morning's fury, still stood. The road behind it was clear. Not a single German tank had crossed. He didn't know it yet, but those 3 hours had changed the course of the local fight at Malmedy. The German Panzer column that attacked his position had orders to break through the American defenses, seize the bridge, and push west toward the supply lines of the 1st and 9th Armies. Had they succeeded, they could have cut through the Allied rear, trapping thousands of soldiers in the Ardennes pocket. But Curry's stand had stopped them cold, literally and figuratively. Because of his defense, reinforcements from the 30th Infantry Division arrived in time to secure the sector. The delayed German column was forced to divert south, where American artillery and airstrikes later caught it in open ground and destroyed it. Those 3 hours, 3 impossible, unrelenting hours, had bought the Allies time they did not have to spare But Curry didn't see that wider picture. Not yet. He only saw the men he had saved, the road still standing, and the twisted armor of tanks that would never roll again. Exhaustion came over him like a wave. He slumped beside the wounded, back against the wall, eyes half closed. For the first time since dawn, he let himself breathe. When an American patrol finally reached the area later that morning, they found a strange scene. One young corporal standing, guard with a rifle over a group of wounded men in the ruins of a factory, surrounded by the wreckage of multiple German tanks. His face was streaked with dirt and blood. His uniform was torn and burned. He looked less like a man and more like a ghost who hadn't realized he was still alive. The patrol officer, stunned by the sight, asked the question every soldier asks after chaos: "Who's in command here?" Curry's answer was simple: "I don't know. I was just trying to keep them alive." That humility, that instinct to minimize what he had done, became the defining note of his story. In the days that followed, officers pieced together the full account. They examined the destroyed armor, the recovered weapons, and the bazooka that had fired multiple direct hits. They interviewed the wounded survivors, who all told the same story. One man had held the bridge, alone, for hours against overwhelming odds. His bravery wasn't speculation, it was written in the blackened. Hulks of Panzers and the still-standing bridge behind him. Reports traveled up the chain of command. Field officers documented every verifiable detail: how Curry had destroyed at least one enemy tank, fired from exposed positions with a Browning automatic rifle and a .50 caliber gun, rescued the wounded under heavy fire, and forced a German retreat. Commanders described it as an act of extraordinary gallantry, one that exceeded the call of duty. Months later, those words would appear again, formalized, preserved, and immortalized on July 27, 1945, in the final summer of the war. President Harry S. Truman awarded Francis Sherman Curry the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration of the United States. The citation read in part, "Sergeant Curry's conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, the 30th Infantry Division, and the United States Army." He was only 20 years old when the medal was pinned to his chest. Reporters asked him what he had felt that morning in Belgium. He didn't have an answer ready. He said simply, "I just did what had to be done." There was no bravado, no cinematic flourish, just a quiet statement of duty, the kind that never makes headlines but holds armies together. He returned home later that year, not as a celebrity, but as a soldier eager to disappear back into ordinary life. There were no parades in his honor, no speeches on stages, just the long road back to New York and the small towns that had shaped him. He carried his medal in a drawer, not on his chest. To him, the true reward was simpler: the knowledge that his comrades had lived, that the bridge had held, and that the line had not broken. In every war, there are moments that don't fit the scale of strategy, moments where history turns not on orders or plans, but on one man's refusal to surrender. December 21, 1944, was one of them. And when historians speak of the Battle of the Bulge, of the desperate winter that nearly broke the Allied advance, they now remember a small ruined factory in Malmedy where one 19-year-old stood alone against steel, and held the line. If these true stories of courage move you, take a moment to help them live on. Each time they're remembered, they remind us what real strength looks like, not in medals or monuments, but in the quiet conviction that one man, at the right place and the hardest hour, can change the course of a war. When the war ended, the world tried to move on. But for Francis Sherman Curry, moving on didn't mean forgetting. It meant rebuilding, quietly, humbly, and without ever mistaking attention for purpose. He returned home to upstate New York in 1945, no longer the quiet boy who had left 2 years earlier. The Army discharged him with honors, his name newly written into military history as one of the youngest recipients of the Medal of Honor in World War II. Yet when the train doors opened and he stepped onto the platform, there was no fanfare waiting. Just a few family members, a cold wind, and the quiet of home. Curry could have toured the country. He could have stood on stages, delivered speeches, or written a book. The newspapers had called him a hero, and for a brief time, his photograph appeared in local headlines. But he didn't care for any of it. He didn't want to relive that day or turn it into legend. He slipped easily back into civilian life, not because it was easy, but because he refused to let the war define him. He took a job at a local auto repair shop before finding long-term work with the Department of Veterans Affairs in Albany, New York, where he spent over 3 decades helping other servicemen navigate the long, often invisible aftermath of war. Those who worked with him described a man who was patient, steady, and unfailingly kind. He filled out paperwork for veterans struggling with benefits, guided them through bureaucracy, and sat with them when memories became too heavy to carry alone. He never bragged, one colleague later said. You'd have no idea he was a Medal of Honor recipient unless someone else told you. His medal stayed in a drawer, wrapped in cloth. When asked about it, he would shrug and say, "It's not about me." Curry married and built a quiet life in South Bethlehem, just outside Albany. He was active in his community, not as a public figure, but as a neighbor. He mowed his lawn, fixed his car, and volunteered at local veteran events when asked. People who met him for the first time often sensed something grounded about him, a calmness that didn't need to prove itself. He had looked death in the face and come home without bitterness. For decades, he rarely spoke about the Battle of the Bulge. If pressed, he described it simply, "We were surrounded. I just did what had to be done." No dramatics. No self-mythologizing. He had seen what war did to men, how it hollowed them out, how even survival carried its own scars. Heroism, to him, wasn't something to celebrate. It was something to live with, and yet his story refused to disappear. Military historians began to cite his defense at Normandy as one of the most remarkable individual actions of the entire Ardennes campaign. Veterans who served with the 30th Infantry Division kept their name alive in reunions and records. Schools began teaching his example not for the violence, but for the values: courage, duty, humility. In 2009, more than 6 decades after that winter morning, the U.S. Congress renamed the post office in Hurleyville, New York, as the Francis Curry Post Office Building, a permanent tribute in the town where he'd grown up. He attended the ceremony reluctantly, wearing a simple dark suit and the same quiet smile that had followed him all his life. When asked to speak, he thanked the town for remembering. then reminded everyone that the real heroes were the ones who didn't come home. Later, a bronze statue was erected in Cazenovia Park, Buffalo, depicting Curry in action. The moment he raised his bazooka amid the ruins, the frozen air turned to smoke and fire. The sculptor captured not the fury of battle, but the resolve of a 19-year-old who had chosen duty over survival. By the 2000s, Francis Curry had become one of the last living Medal of Honor recipients from World War II. Interviewers occasionally sought him out, hoping to capture his reflections while there was still time. He agreed to some, but always with restraint. One interviewer asked how he found the courage to stand his ground that day. Curry's answer was the same as always: "You don't think about courage. You think about the man beside you. You just do what has to be done." There was no mythology in his voice, no poetry, just the quiet certainty of someone who had faced the edge and stepped forward anyway. He passed away on October 8, 2019, at the age of 94. By then, most of his comrades were gone, and his story belonged to history. At his funeral, soldiers in dress blues folded the American flag that draped his coffin and handed it to his family. The ceremony was small, attended by relatives, veterans, and neighbors. The pastor spoke softly of courage and humility, and a military bugler played taps, that haunting, lingering sound that fades into silence. After his passing, tributes poured in from across the country. The U.S. Army issued a statement calling him a symbol of quiet valor. Veterans groups shared photographs and memories. Local children placed flags by his statue, some not old enough to understand the full story but aware somehow that it mattered. And in the years that followed, his legacy continued to grow, not through fame or monuments, but through the lessons his life embodied. In a time when heroism is often mistaken for noise, Curry's story reminds us that strength can be quiet, that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it looks like a man who comes home, goes to work, and lives his life without asking for applause. If you believe true heroism still matters, not the kind broadcast on screens, but the kind built on sacrifice and humility, share his story. Let courage like Curry's speak louder than fame, because the measure of greatness isn't how loudly it's told, it's how long it's remembered. Francis Sherman Curry never wanted to be remembered as a hero, but he showed, through action and through silence, what heroism truly is. History often measures heroism by victories, by cities captured, armies defeated, medals awarded. But the story of Francis Sherman Curry lives in a smaller, quieter space. It's the kind of story that doesn't demand attention, but earns reverence with time, because what happened on that frozen morning in December 1944 was not just a battle. It was a decision. Curry's stand at Malmedy wasn't about strategy. It wasn't about rank or training or even survival. It was about instinct, the human choice to stand firm when everything around you tells you to run. That decision, made in seconds by a 19-year-old corporal in a shattered factory, shaped the fate of a battlefield and echoed through generations that followed. For decades after the war, the men who fought in the Ardennes remembered that bitter winter as the hardest fight of their lives. Some remembered the chaos, the snow thick with ash, the fog that muffled gunfire, the confusion that swallowed orders and names. Others remembered flashes, the sight of tanks burning through the trees, the screams of wounded men, the silence after shell fire. But those who survived near Malmedy remembered something else, that somewhere among the ruins, one man refused to yield. They remembered a single burst of bazooka fire cutting through the dawn, the staccato rhythm of a machine gun roaring from a burned-out half-track. They remembered that when the smoke cleared, the bridge was still standing. Over the years, Curry's story has been taught in military academies and leadership courses, not just as a tale of bravery, but as a lesson in integrity. In classrooms, instructors speak of his suicidal angle, the impossible position he took because it was the right one, because the alternative meant abandoning those who couldn't move. They remind young soldiers that courage doesn't begin with the absence of fear, it begins with responsibility. Students who hear his name don't just learn about a soldier, they learn about the weight of choice. They're asked to imagine the moment. 5 wounded men behind you, tanks closing in, no reinforcements coming. Do you hold your ground? Or do you run and live with the knowledge that your survival costs others their lives? That question, simple and terrible, is what gives Curry's story its lasting power. Because war, for all its scale and politics, always comes down to individual moments, to one person deciding to act. When everyone else is frozen, Curry's courage wasn't loud. It didn't come from command or from ideology. It came from duty, the kind that doesn't need witnesses to be real. In his later years, when people asked him to describe that day, he avoided drama. He never spoke about heroism, only necessity. "I just did what had to be done," he would say. And in that single sentence lies the essence of leadership, the willingness to act without promise of reward, without certainty and without applause, even today, in an age far removed from the mud and snow of the Ardennes. His story carries a kind of moral gravity. We live in a world of convenience and comfort, where danger is distant and courage is often reduced to rhetoric. Yet the question his life poses remains timeless. What do you do when no one tells you what to do? When responsibility falls squarely on your shoulders, when every instinct tells you to step back, to wait, to hope someone else will decide, what do you do? That question is not limited to battlefields. It lives in every moment where integrity is tested, where doing what's right means standing alone. Most of us will never face tank treads bearing down on us through snow. But all of us, at some point, will face moments where silence feels safer than truth, where retreat feels easier than resolve. And that's why Curry's story matters, because it reminds us that courage, in its purest form, is not bound by circumstance. It is the act of saying, "I will stay," when the world gives you every reason to go. The suicidal angle, that phrase written in After Action reports to describe his position, has become more than a tactical note. It's a metaphor, a symbol of all the moments in life where the odds are impossible, where logic says retreat, but conscience says stand your ground. Curry didn't fight that morning because he believed he would win. He fought because someone had to. And in that refusal to yield, he found a kind of immortality. When he passed away in 2019, tributes flowed not just from generals and veterans, but from teachers, students, and ordinary people who had learned his name and carried his lesson forward. Schools held assemblies in his honor. Veterans' halls hung his photograph beside mottos of courage and service. The Army's official remembrance described him as the embodiment of quiet valor. That phrase, quiet valor, captures something we too often forget. Heroism doesn't always come wrapped in spectacle. Sometimes it looks like a 19-year-old kneeling in the snow, fingers bleeding, sighting a bazooka he barely knows how to use and pulling the trigger anyway. When the world speaks of courage, it usually celebrates the outcome. But Francis Curry's story celebrates the moment before, the decision itself. That instant where fear and duty collide, and something unexplainable inside a person chooses the harder path. And maybe that's why his legacy still feels alive today. It's not about war. It's about character. To students who read his story, he is not a statue or a name in a textbook. He is a question. Would I have done the same? To veterans who see his image, he is a reminder of their own choices, of the men they stood beside, and the cost of doing what must be done. And to the rest of us, he is proof that history is not shaped only by generals and nations, but by individuals who act when everything seems lost. As this story closes, remember that moment in Malmedy, the snow falling through smoke, the factory half destroyed, and one soldier standing at a doorway with a frozen weapon and a choice. He didn't know he was changing the course of a battle. He didn't know he would live to see the end of the war. He only knew that running wasn't an option. We often think courage must roar, but sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it sounds like the click of a weapon in the cold, the sound of a breath drawn before the world explodes, or the quiet words of a man who simply says, "I just did what had to be done." If this story moved you, if it made you pause, even for a moment, let it live on. Share it, tell it, remember it. Because the measure of a legacy isn't the number of people who know your name. It's the number of hearts that understand your example. Francis Sherman Curry didn't set out to be remembered. He set out to do what was right. And sometimes that's how history is made, not by those who seek glory, but by those who simply refuse to run. So now, the question passes to you. If the world fell silent, if duty called and fear pressed hard against your chest, if everything in front of you looked impossible, would you stand your ground? Because sometimes the quietest stories carry the loudest lessons, and sometimes the smallest choices, the ones no one sees, are the ones that shape the world.